breaking news this morning, dramatic developments happening in Israel.
12 UN workers took part in the October 7th attack on Israel.
So perhaps you already knew this, that the UN was involved in the October 7th attack. But did you also know that 23 years earlier, on the exact same day, UN peacekeepers helped Hezbollah kidnap Israelis? This is the actual footage that the UN filmed and then tried to cover up. More on this later. Now, these weren't isolated incidents. They were the result of the UN effectively waging war against Israel for decades. And it is a war with violent actors. But before diving deeper, let's remind ourselves of why the UN was created.
The United Nations are now committed
to find a way to end war.
So how did an organization that was supposed to stop war become an active participant in violence against the world's only Jewish state? Once I explain what happened, you'll understand exactly how and why the UN was hijacked. But first, I need to show you just how corrupt it's become. A shocking fact that most people don't know is that the UN was one of the primary causes of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The major escalation in violence can be traced back to the UN's deeply flawed partition plan. In 1920, Britain was awarded the mandate over Palestine with the explicit objective of establishing a Jewish national home there. But instead of honouring this commitment, they immediately handed almost all of the land to the Arabs, who created Jordan. Still, the Jews hoped that what was left would become their state. But once again, Britain reneged on their commitment, this time claiming that they had no power under the terms of the mandate to award the country either to the Arabs or to the Jews, or even to partition it between them. Remember, they had the chutzpah to say this after already awarding 78% of the land to the Arabs. So, after creating absolute chaos due to years of mismanagement and broken promises, Britain shamelessly abandoned Israel and handed the issue over to the United Nations to resolve. Tasked with cleaning up Britain's mess, the UN established a special committee which concluded that a unified Jewish national home would be unacceptable to the Arabs. So, once again, they proposed the land should be partitioned into separate Jewish and Arab states. But their logic made no sense. They claimed that the Arabs couldn't live peacefully under a Jewish government in a unified country, so they proposed creating two states, a Jewish one and an Arab one. But then they proposed that the Jewish state should be 55% Jewish and 45% Arab. Do you see the problem? If the Arabs could coexist in a Jewish state, why the need for partition in the first place? Following the UN's proposed partition, Israel declared independence. 5 Arab armies then invaded, displacing at least, according to the UN, 750,000 people. These are known as the Palestinian refugees. Now, today, the UN claims there are 6 million of them. So, how did we get from 750,000 to 6 million? I'll explain. The UNHCR is the UN agency responsible for looking after all of the refugees in the world. Its mission is simple, to help resettle people displaced by conflict so that they're no longer refugees. Makes sense. That is, unless you're a Palestinian. Incredibly, the UN has an entirely separate agency for Palestinian refugees called the United Nations Relief Work Agency, or UNRWA. This makes the Palestinians the only people in the world with their own UN refugee agency. And there's a very sinister reason for this.
UNRWA started with the best of intentions to settle Arab refugees from the war, was hijacked by the Arab refugees themselves to become a purely Arab-Palestinian organization for the singular cause of ensuring that the Jewish state knows not a day of peace until it is undone.
UNRWA was supposed to help solve the refugee crisis, but instead, it now perpetuates it. That's because normally a refugee is someone that's forced to flee their country due to persecution or violence. And the original Palestinians that fled did fit this definition. When the Arabs launched the 48 war, those civilians that did flee were rightly described as refugees. But here's UNRWA's problem. Most of those refugees aren't alive today. No refugees means no reason for UNRWA to exist. So outrageously, they redefined what a refugee is, or at least what a Palestinian refugee is. According to them, a refugee is now anyone whose paternal line descends from an Arab who lived in British Mandatory Palestine between 1946 and 1948 and then fled. Are you following? They made being a refugee an inheritable status, a characteristic that's passed down from parents to children, generation after generation. But only if you're Palestinian. They're now the only people in the world who, at least according to the UN, can inherit the status of refugee. That means that even if they were born into a safe country and never fled a war, they're considered a refugee. To highlight just how absurd this is, they consider Bella Hadid a refugee. She's a literal supermodel born in America into a life of luxury to a property tycoon. And what's more, she's never fled a conflict in her life. Let that sink in. UNRWA thinks a literal American supermodel is a refugee. Meanwhile, almost every Jewish family I know descends from genuine refugees. But the UN doesn't consider us refugees because in our case, they correctly say that if you flee a war, you're a refugee. If your ancestors did, but you didn't, then you're not. And this is where it takes the sinister turn. UNRWA deliberately corrupted the definition to sustain the conflict. Now, the only way to stop a Palestinian from being a refugee is for them to return to Israel, convincing generations of Palestinians that Israel will disappear and they'll return to a land that they've never set foot in.
October 7th is return. October 7th is the realization of the Palestinian vision of return. It was never an innocent idea. It always had the element of violent, brutal triumphalism over the Jewish state.
So earlier I mentioned the other refugee agency, the UNHCR, which looks after the rest of the world's refugees. Well, if they'd have also looked after the Palestinian refugees, there probably wouldn't be any refugee crisis. That's because they would have focused on resettling the Palestinians in safe countries so that everybody could move on with their lives. But instead, UNRWA chose to prolong the conflict, compounding the refugee crisis, making it worse and worse with every generation. And this is only one of UNRWA's many problems, which we'll be exploring in this video. To say the UN has a bias against Israel would be the understatement of the year. To demonstrate this, I'm going to focus on two key areas: their disproportionate condemnation of Israel and the disproportionate resources they use against Israel. The UN has three key bodies that issue resolutions: the General Assembly, the Security Council, and the Human Rights Council, and all three of them disproportionately target Israel. For example, over the last decade, Israel has been hit with over 3 times the number of critical General Assembly resolutions than every other country in the world. Combined. Think about that for a minute. Israel has received 3 times more resolutions than Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, China, North Korea, every country in the world. And if that doesn't make you question things, then this will. While the UN paints Israel as the ultimate villain, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict accounted for just 2% of all the deaths from major conflicts during this period. 2%. So instead of focusing on the 98%, the UN goes out of its way to attack Israel again and again and again. The Human Rights Council takes this bias even further. It meets 3 times a year to discuss human rights abuses under 2 separate agenda items. One dedicated solely to Israel, item 7, and another, item 4, for every other country in the world. Think about that. They give as much attention to Israel as they do to every other country in the world combined. And who do you think sits on this council right now? Qatar, China, and Sudan. countries that are hardly known for championing human rights. To grasp just how absurd this is, listen to UN Watch's Hillel Neuer.
On November 24th, this council met in urgent session and condemned Iran's arbitrary arrests, excessive use of force, torture, enforced disappearances, and sexual abuse of women protesters. This council is also aware that the two journalists who first reported the death of Mahsa Amini, Niloufar Hamidi and Elahi Mohammadi, are still in prison, and that thousands of schoolgirls were hospitalized for poisoning by toxic gas. Therefore, Mr. President, we have to ask, on what basis did this council appoint the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran as chair of this UN Human Rights Council's social forum starting on November 2nd?
Then there were the Durban conferences. Now these were supposed to combat racism. Good idea, right? Except they turned racist, and instead of combating racism, they declared that Jewish self-determination, Zionism, was racism, while simultaneously giving a podium to the president of Iran to deny the Holocaust at a conference to combat racism. And this circus continues as Iran actively builds nuclear weapons and arms proxies across the Middle East. Guess who the UN appointed as the chair of the disarmament conference? That's right, Iran. Sorry to interrupt, but I've just finished making the video that you're watching, and I felt I had to make an appeal. You see, this video should have taken 2 weeks, but because we didn't have the budget, I had to do everything. The researching, the script writing, the videography, the animations, the editing, and this dragged the project on for 6 weeks. So if you'd like to help us make these videos faster, then you can follow this link to make a small or large tax-deductible donation. And together, we can make a difference. We can fight disinformation, and we can win hearts and minds for Israel. Anyway, back to the video. An important thing to remember is that the Palestinians make up less than 0.1% of the world's population. So you'd think they take up 0.1% of the UN's resources, right? Wrong. UNRWA alone employs around 30,000 people to look after the Palestinian refugees. For perspective, the UN's main refugee agency, the UNHCR, only has 13,000 staff to look after 122 million refugees. So UNRWA has more than double the staff, but a fraction of the people. This costs a staggering $1.5 billion a year. So let's do a little exercise. UNRWA has 6 million so-called refugees on their books. If we divide $1.5 billion by 6 million, it works out that they're spending around $250 per Palestinian refugee. In comparison, if we do the same calculation for the UNHCR, it comes out at around $40 per refugee. In other words, the UN spends 6 times more per Palestinian than it does for actual refugees. To put this in perspective, the UN gives these refugees $40 and this American supermodel $250. What's more is that these so-called Palestinian refugees are almost entirely bankrolled by Western taxpayers, with Islamic nations contributing a mere 6% of UNRWA's budget, which means you foot the rest. Don't think this is just an UNRWA problem though. The UN has created committee after committee to attack Israel. These are just a few. There's no other nation on earth that gets this level of attention from the UN. Now we're going to explore the terror links of 2 UN agencies. The first is UNRWA and the other is UNIFIL. Let's start with UNRWA. Most of the terrorists who carried out the October 7th attack were educated in UNRWA schools, including one of its masterminds, Mohammed Deif. These schools are funded by your tax dollars. This isn't hyperbole. The UN has a terror problem. Just listen to the UN Relief Chief, Martin Griffiths.
I've worked with many different terrorist and insurgent groups. Hamas is not a terrorist group for us, of course, as you know. It's a political movement.
A political movement? Now you're beginning to see just how corrupt and evil the UN is. Their relief chief made this statement after Hamas carried out the October 7th atrocities, not before. Or how about when the then head of UNRWA, Pierre Kriembel, told these Palestinian terror chiefs that we are united and no one can separate us. He was speaking to leaders from Islamic Jihad, Hamas, and several other proscribed groups. Understanding how controversial this meeting was, he added that if the public were to find out, it could lead to a loss of trust between donor countries and UNRWA, which might result in reduced or even terminated funding. So he knew exactly who he was talking to. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. UNRWA has literal blood on its hands.
The UN Relief and Works Agency
has colluded with Hamas and that some of its staff were involved in the October the 7th attack.
Israel has identified UNRWA staff who took part in the October 7th atrocities. People like Mohammed Abu Atiwi, who can be seen here abducting an American citizen, Hirsch Goldberg Polin. May his memory be a blessing. There's also Yusuf al-Khawajara, who can be seen here boasting of kidnapping Jewish Sabaya.
سلامات وين ايش اخبار وين انت؟ وين السبايا والدنيا ودين عنا خليش نايم. في الشارع نام في الدار شارع اسكت احنا عند السبايا هنا مسك واحده.
In February, the IDF uncovered a Hamas intelligence hub directly beneath UNRWA's Gaza headquarters, complete with surveillance rooms, tunnels connected to UNRWA power cables, and stockpiles of weapons. Essentially a Hamas command center, powered and sheltered by UNRWA. This is hardly surprising though, when you consider that out of 12,000 UNRWA staff, around 10% are linked to terror. To understand the gravity of this problem, listen to this former UNRWA employee.
وشاهدت أن هذه الأونروا تخرج مدارس الأونروا تخرج قادة. لذلك كثير من الأسماء الموجودة الآن والذين يمارسون السياسة وقادهم وعلى رأسهم لنقل معلم كان معلم في الأونروا
سيد هنية إسماعيل هنية
الأستاذ إسماعيل هنية كان معلم في الأونروا.
Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, was one of their teachers. But he wasn't alone. Other leaders like Saeed Sayyam, Mohammed al-Jamasi and Suhail al-Khindi all led double lives. By day they were teachers, and by night prominent Hamas operatives. In fact, Fateh al-Sharif, the president of the UNRWA Teachers Union, was also the leader of Hamas in Lebanon. UNRWA schools have become a breeding ground for extremism, convincing generations to engage in violence. Just listen to these kids from an UNRWA school in Jerusalem.
بيحكوا لنا عن اليهود، بيحكوا لنا هدول غدارين، وبيحكوا لنا انه هدول بغدرونا، هدول مش منيح. إذا بطعن بدعس عليهم. أنا بقرأ اليهود. بعلمونا إن الصهيونية هم أعدائنا وهم أهم إشي لازم يسوي فيهم عملية. عمليات الدعس، عمليات الطعن.
أنا بدي أهزمهم بالحرب، بدي أهزمهم.
إيش أكيد هدول العمليات ترفع الراس ولفلسطين. إذا بدك بطلع بستشهد عادي.
One of the disturbing things about those clips is that all of those kids were from Jerusalem, where Jews and Arabs live side by side. They coexist. So if UNRWA is able to radicalize those kids, imagine how bad it is elsewhere, because UNRWA is teaching this extremism in all of their classrooms, in all of their schools.
طب بالك يا محمد شو الحل للقدس؟
محل القدس إنه نقتل اليهود.
قل لي عن العمليات الاستشهادية بيحكوا لكم؟
بيحكوا.
شو بيقولوا لكم؟
بيقولوا إنه الواحد بضحي بدمه بيفدي دمه عشان بلده ترتاح ويموت بسببها يعني.
أنت حابب تكون شهيد؟
إن شاء الله الحمد لله.
عن حق العودة؟ بيقولوا لك؟
زي ما أخذوها إحنا نرجعها في القوة.
بدرسوكم عن الجهاد مثلا؟ بدرسوك عن المقاومة؟ الجهاد بدرسوك؟ شو بيقولوا لك؟
نجاهد ضد الاحتلال.
شهيدة فلسطينية شردت فرجلت اليهود وهجرتهم.
Those kids aren't the outliers. That's standard because the textbooks in the school promote martyrdom and armed struggle. So instead of planting seeds of peace, UNRWA classrooms plant seeds of war. And when you consider who's running the schools and what they're teaching, it's pretty clear that UNRWA is now a barrier to peace. Then there's UNIFIL. They were deployed to Lebanon with one major objective: to disarm Hezbollah. But instead of disarming them, under their watch, Hezbollah is estimated to have amassed 130,000 rockets in the south and to have built huge underground complexes to launch attacks on Israel, all right under the nose of UNIFIL. Quite literally, this is a Hezbollah tunnel directly under one of their observation posts, something they even acknowledged.
Mr. Tenanti, the IDF has revealed that Hezbollah is operating in a close proximity to your post. It even revealed a tunnel next to a tower watch. What is your comment? Have you become human shields for Hezbollah?
Like the tunnel that you mentioned earlier, that was at the time in private property, and we didn't have the mandate to search private property, although we asked several times to have access to.
Wait, you asked Hezbollah if you could examine their terror tunnel, and they said no? Well, color me surprised. Seriously, just in case there's any confusion, their mandate literally says they will take all necessary action in areas of deployment of its forces and as it deems within its capabilities to ensure that its area of operations is not utilized for hostile activities of any kind. So their interpretation of preventing the area from being used for hostile activities was to allow Hezbollah to build up terror tunnels and deploy over 130,000 rockets. But then do nothing about this because it was on private property. Other than taking bribes from Hezbollah, what on earth did they do for the last 46 years? Oh, that's right. They helped Hezbollah abduct 3 Israelis. On October the 7th, 2000, 3 Israeli soldiers were taken in a brutal cross-border raid. UNIFIL troops were right there watching it unfold, but they didn't intervene. Instead, they filmed the whole thing. And when Israel begged them for the footage, hoping that it could help locate the soldiers, instead of handing it over, the UN lied, insisting that there was no tape. Eventually though, scenes from the tape leaked, proving what everyone suspected. The tape existed all along. Only then did the UN admit to the truth, but by then it was too late. The soldiers were already dead. The United Nations is a sham, a democracy of dictatorships. Its member states vote on resolutions, while half of them don't even allow their own citizens to vote. Imagine a courtroom where criminals sit as both the judge and jury, where nations with appalling human rights records wield the same power as free democratic societies. Here, dictators direct the narrative, using voting blocs like the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to divert global resources towards their own agendas and away from real humanitarian disasters. What makes this even more offensive is that Western democracies fund the lion's share of this operation, with billions in taxpayer dollars propping up an organization that not only enables but empowers its most corrupt members. With the most treacherous regime steering global policy and paying nothing into the system, the UN isn't just ineffective, it has been corrupted from within. Instead of promoting peace, it empowers human rights abusers, turning a blind eye to the very injustices it was created to prevent.
وأزيل الغاصب من بلدي وأبيد فلول الغرباء